All right, we have breaking news to report. NBC News can confirm now that Margaret Thatcher, the longest-serving Prime Minister of the UK and the only woman to serve in the post, has died. She was 87 years old. So Margaret Thatcher has passed away. That news just breaking moments ago.
News just breaking. Margaret Thatcher did not change history. Margaret Thatcher bent history in every way. She was a trailblazer for women, of course, but also she took over a dead party in 1975. The Conservatives were really about as weak as could be. Over the next 4 years, the shopkeeper's daughter, who was excluded not only from the men's clubs, but also excluded from the elite circles in Great Britain, she led a revolution. It could only be called a revolution. And in 4 years, the Tories took control of 10 Downing Street. She led for over a decade, and she saved Great Britain's economy. It is strange when you go to Great Britain, you still don't see that this great woman, you still don't see the recognition received. But Steve Ratner, you actually worked for the New York Times in the early 80s, in some of her more tumultuous years, and you've told me that Margaret Thatcher bent history, and without Thatcher's leadership, Great Britain would be France today economically.
At best. When you say she took over a dead party, she took over a dead country in a lot of ways. Britain was still suffering, even then in the late 70s, from the after effects of World War II. It was a poor country. It was in the grip of organized labor. There were strikes all the time. Britain was then a big coal mining country, and the coal miners would go on strike repeatedly. The trade unions would go on strike. And she just came in and was, in fact, what she's now called the Iron Lady. She really did had this incredible force of personality. I traveled with her a little bit around the country, but just that force of personality, that certainty that she had was really extraordinary, and she did turn Britain into a modern country. There's no question about it.
It seems strange. You say she turned Great Britain into a modern country. The fact is, from 1945 to 1979, from Clement Attlee's prime ministership right after the war when Churchill was booted out, until Thatcher took over in 79, the economy was in such a state of decline. They centralized power, they nationalized factories, they nationalized so much of Great Britain, and it was really economically withering on the vine. And then Margaret Thatcher came in. How did she do it, Steve?
It was
How did she change history?
It was almost a socialist country in that sense. The point you make, that so much of the economy was controlled by the government, and she just came in and started privatizing. Now, one of the advantages you have in Great Britain, as you know, is the parliamentary system. So everything we've talked about on this show for all these years of congressional gridlock doesn't really exist in Britain. When a prime minister comes in with a significant majority, which she had, because her timing was also great, the country had realized that they needed to make this change. She had the support in Parliament, and she was able to put through these things, these reforms, and get them done. And it's a very different political system than ours, and it works.
Let's go to John Meacham. He's on the phone right now. John Meacham, of course, we could talk about how she bent history as a prime minister, being the first woman prime minister, or what she did economically to revive this economically moribund country. We could talk about her 3 consecutive terms as prime minister in Great Britain. But the fact is, we don't have to talk in the past tense. Thatcherism still reigns in Great Britain, and it still reigns in Great Britain because Tony Blair realized when he became prime minister that the only way to move forward was by adopting most of Margaret Thatcher's economic policies.
Absolutely. She created the conversation in which Great Britain continues to live in much the same way her great friend Ronald Reagan did for the United States. It's given to few people to change both the history of your country and the history of the world, but Thatcher did that. She and Reagan, with their Cold War hawkishness, were incredibly important in changing at least the tenor and, in many ways, the substance as well of the conversation about what the West was going to do about communism. And before Reagan and Thatcher, it was still positive. Everybody was talking about détente. Everyone talked about coexistence. During and after Reagan and Thatcher, people talked about the end of the Soviet Union. I've always thought it was wonderfully poetic that Reagan went to London and talked about putting Marxist-Leninism on the ash heap of history in Margaret Thatcher's Britain.
You know, it's interesting, Mika, that Reagan's detractors in the 80s that called him a warmonger now, today, as they look back, realizing how terribly wrong they were, will try to give credit to Mikhail Gorbachev for ending the Cold War. That is a laughable proposition. He was forced into the corner, and he was forced into the corner by Ronald Reagan, by Margaret Thatcher, by Pope John Paul II, and by a few other tough conservative leaders that made sure that the Soviet Union would rest on the ash heap of history. Margaret Thatcher was part of that coalition, standing shoulder to shoulder with Ronald Reagan and Pope John Paul II, and they took down the Soviet Union.
It's amazing when you think about that. We're talking about Hillary Clinton potentially leading this country someday, but this woman defied all odds in so many ways. We're just past the top of the hour. We have breaking news to report. NBC confirming that former British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher has died at the age of 87. She was the first woman Prime Minister of the UK and the longest serving in the job. The cause of death, a stroke. She was born in 1925. The daughter of a grocer. She grew up to become a chemist and then ultimately the Prime Minister of the UK and, of course, nicknamed, known around the world as the Iron Lady.